Good day to you all, and herzlich willkommen to the Botstiber podcast. This podcast brings together some of the most influential historians, politicians, and more from across the United States and former lands of the Habsburg Empire to discuss the incredible people and events that connect them. My name is Luke Morgante, and today we are here with the industrious and endearing Andrew Nagorski. In the 1940s, his parents Sigmund and Maria made the journey from Poland to the United States as émigrés. His father's subsequent work with the U.S. Foreign Service provided ample opportunities to get a taste for the world, priming the young Nagorski well for his truly transatlantic literary and journalistic career. In 1973, he joined the editing team at Newsweek, where he continued to thrive in editorial and foreign correspondency roles. In 1982, his enterprising reporting as Newsweek's Moscow bureau chief came in conflict with the agenda of the Soviet regime, leading to his expulsion from the country and consequently providing much inspiration for his first book-length project, Reluctant Farewell, an American reporter's candid look inside the Soviet Union. Since then, he has produced a number of other books, primarily covering the events and individuals that shaped World War II. His latest work, Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom, takes a very transparent and personal approach to the life and legacy of renowned psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. The story emphasizes his relationships with a diverse group of individuals who would ultimately help Freud escape from his lifelong Vienna home shortly after the Anschluss of Austria by Nazi Germany in 1938. It's really nice to finally meet you, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
A pleasure being here too, Luke.
As you mentioned in the book, I wanted to bring this up first. There are two key Freud museums today. One at his original Berggasse 19 or 19 residence in Vienna, where he spent most of his life, and the other in his London residence, where he spent his final year after fleeing from the Nazis. Do you recall your first time being at one of these museums, kind of what your relationship was with Freud at that point, and if you have been back since completing this book and becoming so intimate with his family, himself, and their stories?
I certainly recall the last time I was in both museums because I had wanted to go back there while I was writing the book, but that happened to coincide with a pandemic, which meant travel was almost impossible. So as soon as travel resumed, I went to Vienna, went to Berggasse. As you know, the Berggasse apartment and office and now museum has been redone It's a little more dynamic, more exhibitions than it was originally. And it's always, having done all this research on Freud, I really felt this was familiar territory to me, even though I hadn't explored it all that much earlier. And then I was in London in August, this last August, so about a year later, and visited the Maresfield Garden House, which also has the distinction of having most of his most famous furniture, like the famous couch, a lot of his statuettes, a lot of things that his rescuers, the people I write about in Saving Freud, managed to get out, particularly Marie Bonaparte, one of the characters in that book. So in there, it's a somewhat different experience than in Vienna, in that it almost feels like you go from one room to the other. It almost feels lived in right now, and you almost expect, I'm going to run into Sigmund or Anna or Martha around the corner.
To what extent did you feel a personal connection to the family by the time you had finished the book?
By the time I finished the book, I felt a very strong personal connection. I have to say, when I started on this project, that did not exist. To me, I think, as to many people, Freud was this iconic figure, fascinating, someone you read about in any introductory psychology course or any intellectual history course. But he always seemed somewhat aloof, a fairly cold figure, and his personality was not three-dimensional at all to me. And I think in most, this often happens with famous figures in history. They become almost cutouts. But as I researched the book, And particularly as I read his extensive correspondence. And one of the great gifts to any modern historian or writer is the fact that someone like Freud and his contemporaries wrote letters to themselves, to each other all the time. Freud was an amazing correspondent, and those letters give you a feel of what he was thinking on that particular day about this particular issue or this particular person. And there's an intimacy there, and also a beauty in the language which comes through. He was a very good writer. And I sometimes really worry about future historians who are going to have to try to untangle emails and texts and or whatever other forms of electronic communication. Even if they manage to sort it out, it doesn't have. It's not written the same way as people who were writing before, when they wrote either by pen or typewriter or on their typewriters. The whole experience, the tactile experience of writing, I think affects the quality of the writing. I just felt I got to know him. For instance, his relationship with Martha Freud, before they were married for 4 years, they were engaged while she was in Hamburg and he was in Vienna most of the time, and he did not feel he had enough money to marry and start a family. So he was trying to get his career going. During that course of those 4 years, Freud wrote about 900 letters to Martha. And those just reveal so much about his young personality and about his interests. I really did feel, as I was ending the book, that I very close to Freud, and I also came to appreciate not just his breakthrough of psychoanalysis, which of course is the most famous thing, but his sensitivity and the way he treated people and the way he observed the world around him, and things like his very dry sense of humor, which most people do not associate with Freud at all.
It was really interesting as I was reading along the book to find that it wasn't necessarily always about Freud himself or his discoveries or even the implications of the Anschluss and the rise of anti-Semitism, but a large amount of the book seems to point at the very basic but important human story of familial relations, relations with friends, and how your relationships kind of define your understanding of yourself as well as the world around you. And pretty early on, you draw a comparison between the experiences of Freud and Hitler, both in Vienna. Freud being a bit older and having lived there longer, and Hitler coming with his mother in the early 1900s, and that the experiences that Hitler had in Vienna can be heavily credited with shaping his later awful policies, of course, and anti-Semitic mindset. The different politicians that were in power in Vienna at the time, one of the names mentioned was Karl Lueger. But then there's also this side to Vienna where a Jewish psychologist or psychoanalyst with this crazy new theory in the eyes of many is able to rise to peak celebrity status, arguably the most famous person in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. How do you describe these two sides to Vienna at the time, and how do you think they played roles in shaping both of these individuals?
Well, they played a huge role. And Vienna is really, I feel, almost a character in my book, in the sense that, well, first of all, it's a city I've been to many times in many circumstances, and it's a city I love going back to. But I also was always aware of its different sides. I happened to be there, for instance, in the 1980s when the Kurt Waldheim presidential campaign was going on, and you could see how sort of some of the old anti-Semitic impulses were being aroused again. And yet, it's a majestic city. In order to understand Freud and his mindset, which I felt I couldn't just go into the story of how Freud got out of Vienna and why it took him so long to even consider leaving Vienna. I had to get into his mindset as he was growing up, when Vienna was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Vienna was a city which was incredibly cosmopolitan in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as the empire was. It was multinational, and Jews were about 10% of the population. And there was very strong anti-Semitism, but yes, many Jews were incredibly successful there in the arts, in the sciences, in all sorts of fields. And Freud himself was aware of anti-Semitism, but never let it stop him, and never allowed it to intimidate him. In fact, he would confront one of the few times where he actually came head to head with somebody who was anti-Semitic, who was, for instance, threatening his boys. He just charged right at them. He was not going to back down. You could go to Vienna or grow up in Vienna as Freud did from age 4, and as a Jewish intellectual do very well there, and have a very broad outlook on life. Or you could be someone like Hitler, who comes to Vienna, who thinks he's going to be this great artist, who doesn't pass the exam for the Fine Arts Academy and is frustrated and falls in with kind of all the people who are the most frustrated underbelly of that population, and it feeds his paranoia, his whole somebody's got to be blamed for his own failures. So both were possible in Vienna, and for me, one of the intriguing notions was to imagine that somewhere on the streets of Vienna, during the time when those two men overlapped, they might have passed each other on the street. But it's also they were moving in different worlds, even though they were physically in the same city.
And you mentioned how there was the one scene, I believe he was at like a shipyard or at a dock with his boat and two of his sons, and he just confronts this group of, I believe it's like 10 men who are just shouting anti-Semitic rhetoric at him and his sons, threatening them, and he just walks right through. And I was trying to kind of understand through the course of this story who Freud was as a person, and it seems very disparate at times between his family life and personal private life, and that of his demeanor and personality when conducting psychoanalysis or in a professional workspace.
That incident which you mentioned of confronting this anti-Semitic small group of people I thought was very revealing. This happens when a couple of his sons are still quite small, and they've gone out on this pond to go fishing on the outskirts of Vienna, and some people started gathering around and shouting anti-Semitic remarks at them, claiming they could not fish there, although there was no restriction on it. And the boys came home and quite troubled, and Freud promptly marched out with them, and they got in a rowboat to cross this little pond towards where this group of people was. I think it was mostly men, but there were also some women too. And Freud had a walking stick. He gets out of the rowboat and he just starts swinging this walking stick back and forth. It's like a parting of the waters, and everybody scatters at the sight of this rather stern-looking figure wielding his walking stick. And so it showed that Freud did not want to be seen as ever giving into this sort of thing. In fact, Freud recalled something his father once told him, that once his father said, I was walking down the street and a man grabbed my hat and shouted anti-Semitic slogans at me, and then threw my hat in the gutter. And Freud, who was a small boy at the time, asked his father, "Well, what did you do?" And the father said, "Well, I knelt down and collected my hat." And Freud was very upset about this. He felt his father didn't stand up to this man. He allowed himself to be humiliated. Later in life, he was more forgiving and realized what the circumstances might have been. But he was determined to always to stand up to people if those kinds of things happened. But at the same time, his oldest son, Martin Freud, writing about this incident, said, "My father never mentioned this incident again. It was just something normal. He responded, and as far as he was concerned, that was that." And that was also something that was, I think, very, very revealing about Freud, that he was willing to stand up, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. Okay, things happen. There are people who are anti-Semites, who are bullies, and you just stand up to them and you go on with your life.
And he carried this, maybe not indifference, but he liked to address all these difficult issues head on and try to recognize them as what they were in the moment, it seems, as opposed to having this ongoing, persisting fear of what they could mean for the future. And do you believe that that is also evident in how he would treat his patients, where during the psychoanalysis he was able to remain as neutral as possible? And he would discuss with them very personal, very taboo subjects such as incest, or at the time, it was obviously much more controversial, but homosexuality. And he was often very frank and candid with them. But then it was very clear in some of his letters and correspondences outside of psychoanalysis that he had opinions on these subjects. How do you understand his differentiation between the psychoanalytic patients and that professional work and his own personal understanding of the world around him?
I found one of the most interesting things was this contrast, as you say, between the Freud who counseled patients and who went through this whole process of psychoanalysis and the way he conducted his own personal life. For instance, of course, a lot of Freud's theories are based on human sexuality and the notion that we repress so much and society is so hypocritical. And he once said something along the lines, I stand for an infinitely freer sexual life, although I myself have made very little use of such freedom. So his patients would come to him, and many of people who became his future colleagues would come to him and would describe all sorts of sexual a sexual lifestyle and a level of activity that he never was engaged in himself. He was married to one woman his whole life, and for more than 50 years. And he had a very conventional lifestyle with very set habits about his daily routine. But he was not judgmental about those who lived a very different lifestyle. And he felt that it was the role of psychoanalysis not to be judgmental, but to help people with these things. But in his, again, going back to his correspondence, you can see that he also had, while he was conservative personally in terms of lifestyle, he was very, for his time, he was certainly way ahead of his time. You mentioned homosexuality. There were a couple of cases where American mothers wrote to him saying, I would like to have you accept my son as a patient and to psychoanalyze them. And in one of these letters, the mother describes her son's problems, but Freud writes back and says, from what you say, I can see that you believe your son is a homosexual, but you never say that. Why don't you? It's not something to be ashamed of. And if you think you're coming to me as a psychoanalyst to quote unquote cure him of his homosexuality, then this is a mistake, because no one will change unless they want to change. And he also said we should be aware that homosexuality has existed in all sorts of civilizations, including some of what we consider the highest civilizations like the Greeks, and often was treated as something quite noble. So let us not be judgmental about it. And psychoanalysis he said, I have psychoanalyzed homosexuals who come in quite troubled by their own identity and their own tendencies, but through psychoanalysis they become much more comfortable with who they are. In other words, they remain homosexuals, but they come to terms with it. So to see that, and at that point this is the early 20th century, it's a very different approach than almost anybody was taking then. And its whole openness about the sexual issues was considered shocking at the time. But I think he was a true revolutionary in his thinking, but a conservative in his personal lifestyle.
That was one of my favorite parts of the book, when he's explaining how the patients would come in very troubled with the fact that they were simply homosexual. And then by the end of a session or two, once he was able to convince them that it was okay and it was just part of their identity almost, then that acceptance immediately made them feel as if they no longer needed any psychoanalysis. And that was that. But the next thing I wanted to talk about was in one of the instances where his professional life overlapped heavily with his personal life was his daughter Anna, the youngest of his children, I believe, who from a very young age felt she had to almost compete for her father's attention. She wasn't able to go out with her older siblings to certain events with him. So from very early on, she felt very close with him and the need to impress him. And this led to her becoming quite an impressive psychoanalyst and one of, if not the closest individual to Freud in his life. But there's another figure as well, Marie Bonaparte, who may not have been his daughter by birth, but definitely develops similar roles to a daughter for Freud. Can you kind of explain who Anna and Marie Bonaparte were? And also, I was curious if you could add what their relationship was like with each other.
Yeah, Anna Freud was the sixth of his 6 children and a favorite, and especially she had competed very much growing up for her father's attention with her next oldest sister, Sophie Freud. But Sophie Freud, when she's in her 20s, dies of the Spanish flu, and this is a horrible loss to all of the Freud family. But what really defines Anna's life is the fact that as she grows up, she stays in the household. All her older siblings leave, get married, start their own lives. Anna stays, and from an early age, for instance, as a 13 or 14-year-old, she's already sitting in on the sessions of Freud and his colleagues on these Wednesday night gatherings in the apartment where they're discussing all their new theories of psychoanalysis. And later on, she becomes a very noted child psychoanalyst. And she continues to live with her parents in Berggasse 19 and then in London. She never marries. And in many portrayals, she's seen as someone who is fairly, a single woman. But in fact, she develops a very close friendship with an American woman by the name of Dorothy Burlingham, whose family name is Tiffany, from the Tiffany family. The famous Tiffany and Company was started by her grandfather, Charles Tiffany, and then her father was Louis Comfort Tiffany, the famous, all the Tiffany glass that we now know that is world famous was first designed by him. And Dorothy Burlingham Tiffany comes to Vienna in the 20s to have her 4 children who are having all sorts of problems after Dorothy divorced her husband, to be treated by Anna, and eventually they develop a very close relationship and they become companions for life. It's never quite explicit whether there is a sexual component to this or not, but they are in effect, everyone in the family treats them as a couple. They live together. Dorothy lives in apartments close by, and it's only after Freud dies and Martha Freud dies that she moves in full time with Anna, but they are always together. So Anna Freud stays and becomes Freud's main professional colleague in Vienna and then in London, actually represents him when he no longer can go to various psychoanalytic conferences. And she also is a caregiver when he comes down with cancer of the jaw and has to have these prostheses put in, which are very awkward and painful. She's the one who knows how to do that. And so she really stays with him all the time. And then the other person who enters the picture in the 1920s is Marie Bonaparte, who the name itself should ring some bells because her grandfather was the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte. So she is a great grand niece of Napoleon. So she has that on her resume. And then when she's a young woman, she marries the Prince of Greece and Denmark. So she becomes a princess, but she has a very distant marriage. She is very sexually active and has affairs with all sorts of people, including the Prime Minister of France, Aristide Briand. But she is frustrated sexually. She can't achieve orgasm. She eventually finds her way to Freud in Vienna to help with these problems. And he is not able to solve that problem, but she becomes so devoted to Freud that she first studies with him and then becomes a psychoanalyst in her own right and a major supporter of the psychoanalytic movement. And then, along with Anna, a major player in the effort to get Freud out of Vienna when it's almost too late to do so.
I was curious because they both play major roles in Freud's life and in the book, but there's not much overlap within about the relationship between the two of them, Anna and Marie. And I was curious if there was ever any tension of any kind, because I know the young Anna at times could be jealous if she didn't have enough time with her father, if she felt that even Martha at times was spending more time with him than she was able to. Were there ever any conflicts between Anna and Marie, or was it more cordial?
I did not come across any conflicts. Remember, Marie comes into Freud's life in the mid-1920s, so Anna is already a grown woman too. So she's more secure in her relationship with her father. She's gone through psychoanalysis with her father, which, by the way, was something he says later on. I wouldn't recommend that psychoanalysts psychoanalyze their own children, but in Anna's case, it was okay. But no, in fact, they had a pretty close relationship, and Marie was very sensitive that this was a very close-knit family and was very supportive of everyone in the family. And Martin Freud, the oldest brother, the oldest son of the Freuds, said that Anna was really someone who kept us together and really helped us keep our morale up when the Nazis took over and when you had this harrowing time of trying to get out of Vienna. So she provided not only material assistance, she provided the money for a lot of the bribes that the Nazis were demanding, but she provided moral assistance. And I think and Anna Freud, who always was determined to do the most she could to protect and her father in every way, understood that and really appreciated that.
It's very interesting. Thank you for answering. That's been probably my biggest personal question for a while, if there ever was anything between those two. But very much like Freud at times could be hypocritical when it came to himself, and he took his daughter Anna for psychoanalysis treatment under his own authority, whereas he denounced that practice for others. He also was very against using psychoanalysis in reporting at first and in criticism of public figures. But later on, after meeting the US diplomat William Bullitt, he famously agrees to make a very critical book about Woodrow Wilson and his role at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. Why do you think that Freud was willing to make this change and kind of backtrack on his earlier beliefs that psychoanalysis should be separate?
Yeah, I would say about when concerning Freud and his change of heart about psychoanalyzing your own children. First of all, when he did that with Anna, it was very early days of psychoanalysis. The kind of the rule books were not written yet. There was a lot of improv, and that was the improvisation in his case, and he came to realize that this should not be the model going forward. So I wouldn't call it hypocrisy. Maybe I think a little gradual self-awareness. The Woodrow Wilson case is something different. William Bullitt, who was this very gifted first American journalist and then diplomat, had come to Freud in the 20s with his own sexual problems for analysis. And then Freud discovers that Bullitt is planning to write a book about the world leaders at the time in the 20s and during World War I. And he's doing a chapter on Woodrow Wilson. And they get to talking and they discover they both have the same feeling about Wilson, which is that they despised him. They had different reasons. Bullitt did because he felt that he had actually been part of the peace delegation at the end of World War I and felt that Wilson had totally ignored his recommendations and sent him off to Russia to to as a young diplomat to even negotiate with Lenin and Trotsky and others, and then totally basically washed his hands of him and his recommendations. And Freud, as an Austrian, felt that the Treaty of Versailles and everything was a disaster in terms of course, destroying the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also in laying the groundwork for what they felt were going to be future conflicts, which proved unfortunately accurate. So he then disregards his own rule, as you say, of our recommendation not to try to apply psychoanalysis at a distance to, say, world leaders or to any public figure, because he is so passionate about Wilson, and that passion is met by William Bullis fashion, and they do this book together. Incidentally, the book took a long time to do. They had some disputes over the content, and then they were hesitant about publishing it. It didn't get published till after both of them had died. So it was not, and when it did get published, it got pretty poor reviews. So this was not Freud's best literary effort. Freud did very well. He was a very good writer, as I pointed out, but I think the fact that he went against some of his own strictures and recommendations and did this book did not serve him too well in this case.
As a journalist yourself, I'm curious to what your opinion on the application of psychoanalysis in journalism is. And coincidentally, in your book, you mentioned the names John Gunther multiple times, as well as Dorothy Thompson and Vincent Sheehan, all of whom were very revolutionary at the time and important U.S. foreign correspondents during the interwar periods. John Gunther writing quite famously he wrote, I'm forgetting the name, I believe it's Inside Europe.
Inside Europe, yeah. He wrote a whole series of books, Inside Europe, Inside Germany, Inside France, so forth, yes.
And the last podcast that we did was with Dr. Deborah Cohen from Northwestern University about her book, Last Night at the Hotel Imperial, which covers those three journalists and Frances Gunther, John Gunther's wife, and H.R. Knickerbocker, all of whom were said to take a lot of Freud's teachings into their own work.
Yes.
And try to paint more personal descriptions of the many dictators that were rising at this time. In your experience, how should or how does psychoanalysis fit into journalism, and to what extent did it fit into your own?
Yeah. Incidentally, before I get to that part, Dorothy Thompson did know Freud in Vienna, and I think John Gunther met him at least once. He was not that impressed with him personally, but they were all under, I mean, Freud's shadow was everywhere. And in terms of the notion that you have to get more inside the thinking of leaders, not just their positions, what they normally say about what their policies are, I think that too can be traced back to Freud. And as a journalist, I always felt I wanted to convey, especially when I was in places like the Soviet Union, Poland, Germany, Austria, convey how to my readers, particularly readers back in the States, although I also wrote for the international edition of Newsweek, but of basically people who were not where I was, the kind of the mindset that was there, not just of the leadership, but of people who were going through these experiences and evaluating it. I wouldn't call it psychoanalysis per se, but attempting to, but there is a touch of that, of trying to, what motivates a leader today to certain kind of behavior, particularly when it's really reckless behavior, really violent behavior. What motivates a Vladimir Putin today, for instance, to invade Ukraine and to pursue this war with the savagery that he's doing that. I think you can't do that simply based on what are his ostensible goals and positions or how other people analyze it. You do at a certain point almost have to try to imagine yourself in his position, and then why would you even begin to go down this road? As an example, My first posting in Moscow in the early 1980s, when Brezhnev was in his final years, and everyone was saying the Soviet Union, Brezhnev's regime was in decline. I once did do a piece where I said, imagine if I was Brezhnev, what would I be thinking about the world right now? And just did that as an exercise. It's a little bit of a risky exercise, but I think at least it makes readers consider perspectives that they may not have considered before. And so, in that sense, yes, psychoanalysis does creep into a lot of fields, and journalism was absolutely one of them.
Did, by any chance, your account that came out in 1985, The Reluctant Farewell, right after your time in the Soviet Union, how much inspiration came from John Gunther's work? Because it seems quite like there might be some parallels.
I don't think it came that reluctant farewell on the Soviet Union. That I don't think it was inspired by Gunther, and that was my most personal sort of book about just my experiences as a reporter in the Soviet Union. But of course, the experiences of previous reporters were in my mind, and I felt, especially when I was reporting from Germany and Austria, I was very conscious of the things that people like John Gunther, William Shirer, Dorothy Thompson, and others did. And that's one of the reasons why I find that period so fascinating. It was to think, if I had happened to have been born much earlier than I was, and I had been in their shoes, what would I have done? And first of all, what would I have understood? I always tell people, don't immediately go to what would I have done, but what would I have understood about what was happening in the world around me? Because it is very difficult when you're in the midst of major events to really understand their direction or where they'll end up. I happen to have spent that last part of the Cold War mostly on the other side of what was later called the Iron Curtain. I can't say that I was able to predict that in 1989 that whole world would collapse. I had a feeling that at some point it would, but how and when exactly, I was no prophet. And I think the same way we tend to look back at the rise of the Third Reich and what happened in that part of the world and say, well, people must have immediately understood where this was going and how it was going to turn out. Not necessarily. And that's why I try to put the readers in that period then. And one of the things which I think with in Saving Freud, that what intrigued me about this story was, here was this man who had so many brilliant insights about the working of the human mind, and who also understood something about the dangers of radical mass movements. His book Civilization and Its Discontents, written in 1930, talked about the dangers of what he called the bestiality of man and the blind willingness of many people to blindly follow demagogues. And yet, in his own life, he kept hoping against hope that he would not have to contend with that in Vienna in the 30s, that somehow it would not touch his life and his family's life. And that's why he ended up staying in Vienna as long as he did, until actually Hitler was speaking just a short way away from where he lived. So I think it's always easy in retrospect to say, I would have understood this, and then maybe I would have done the logical things. But when you're in the midst of these events, it's much harder. And even someone like Sigmund Freud could delude himself.
Freud, while it may be hard for some to understand why he would wait so long to actually leave Vienna, he waited for the Anschluss, which he, until the last moment, was hoping could be avoided by the Austrian government at the time, but then even stayed a little bit afterwards, arguably too late, if not for the introduction of Anton Sauerwald to the rescue team that helped him escape to London. Could you kind of explain how Anton Sauerwald played into this dramatic escape, and how you would describe his character to people that don't know him?
Yes, one of the, I mean, there are The well-known figures in the escape, and we've talked about Anna Freud, Marie Bonaparte, William Bullitt, who was by that time the U.S. ambassador to France and who was assigned the chief U.S. diplomat in Vienna to keep coming around to Freud's apartment so that when the Nazis were coming in, they could see the Americans were monitoring this. And then this was a time when there was still the assumption that Hitler did not want to needlessly antagonize the Americans and still was a little bit PR conscious, let us say. And then you also had Ernest Jones, who was his British supporter, a Welshman who was a fervent proponent of psychoanalysis and who had come early on to help Freud, and then went back to London to work on getting entry permits, because there are two parts of this process. Once they convinced Freud that he had to get out of Vienna, and Freud himself became convinced of that when Anna Freud was called into the Gestapo, and he was almost beside himself with fear that she would not return. She does return, but he realizes, he said, look, we're at this point, Freud is over 80. Martha Freud is in her late 70s. He said, our lives are coming to an end soon. And maybe we would stay if it was only about us, but it's about Anna too, who will never leave us. And she's got a long life ahead of her, God willing. And therefore, we have to get out. And he agrees to this operation. And Ernest Jones goes back to work on entry permits, because already countries like Britain, the US, and others were certainly not eager to accept Jewish refugees from the Third Reich, even famous refugees like Freud. But then there is the other part of the process, is how do you get permission from the new Nazi authorities to get out of Vienna? And when the Nazis came in, they assigned someone called a trustee to the prominent Jewish families. And usually those were also wealthy Jewish families. And one was assigned to Freud, and that was Anton Sauerwald. He was a 35-year-old Nazi official. He was a chemist by education, and he came in looking like the typical anti-Semite, spewing very, very aggressive rhetoric. And the job of that trustee was to try to extort as much money and wealth from these Jewish families. And then it wasn't quite clear what would happen next. Would they be allowed to leave? Would they be imprisoned? This was, remember, still a few years before the Holocaust starts in earnest. So everything's a little bit ambiguous. So a lot depended on the trustee. And this man, Sauerwald, who starts out sounding horrible and very threatening, spends a lot of time in the Freud apartment with Freud. And after a while, he started, aside from going over everything about their finances and their possessions, he also starts reading Freud's works and is very impressed by them. And it turns out that Sauerwald, when he was at the University of Vienna, had a chemistry professor who was an elderly Jewish professor who was a friend of Freud. He had subsequently died, but this Sauerwald, despite his anti-Semitism, remembered this professor fondly, and it seemed that he somehow transferred those feelings somewhat to Freud. He saw Freud as somewhat of a similar figure, and he began to speak in much more reassuring terms to particularly Anna Freud, who was handling a lot of the dealings with these Nazi officials. And at one point, in fact, when a bunch of Nazis burst in and were very imperious in their behavior, he said, "Oh, you can't, they're Prussians. They don't understand how important your father is." So, yeah, as a good Austrian, he was also getting across that he was far more civilized than the so-called Prussians. So, what happens at a key moment is that Sauerwald finds out that Freud has some foreign bank accounts. Now, that was perfectly normal and legal before the Anschluss. Freud had foreign patients, particularly from the US and Britain, and he had some foreign bank accounts. And so there was money that the Nazis now considered to be illegal money. And if they had known about this, they might have, that in itself might have been grounds enough to hold Freud and say he can't leave Vienna at all. And Sauerwald, it's not so much what he does, it's what he doesn't do. He doesn't tell his superiors about these foreign bank accounts, at least not until Freud gets out of the country and has all the permissions to do that. So it turns out in the end that there's even one Nazi here who I count as kind of a late recruit to the rescue squad, a very different profile than all the other rescuers, but a rescuer nonetheless.
What do you feel is his legacy in helping them? Because on one hand, he is clearly a Nazi, and even before the Anschluss, he is part of the Nazi party in the city. He's spewing the rhetoric when he first meets them, and he continues to work with the Nazis throughout the war. However, following Freud's death and the conclusion of the war, when Anna Freud finds out that he is being imprisoned for his role alongside the Nazis, she writes a letter saying that he was paramount to their escape, and this leads to his freedom from those crimes.
Yes, I mean, the Freud family was actually split on Sauerwald's role. The Anna Freud, as you say, was the one who said she observed him up close. She felt he played a crucial role. One of Freud's nephews, who later was in the U.S. Army, actually wanted to have him prosecuted for his role. And it was Anna who tried to set him straight on that. So I think, first of all, he was a relatively unknown figure until recently. And for instance, in the Vienna archives, there's just a little bit of information about him. But he's I'd say he's one of these characters who's interesting, not because he had a momentous role, but his role may have been critical enough in that one area at a critical moment that he really has to be part of this story of how Freud and his family got out of Vienna.
Okay, so finally, going into the book, when you were first writing Saving Freud, what were you hoping that the message would be, or what did you hope that readers would take away from the story? And did that change at all to now? What do you hope when you're talking to someone who has read the book, or you're hearing about it being sold everywhere on the bookshelves? There's numerous reviews. Even Seth MacFarlane, the famous writer of Family Guy, left a review. What do you hope that people take away from Freud's story and the story of his peers?
Well, what I hope and what I hope from the beginning is, first of all, I wanted to, when I started this, as I say, to understand the story, who Freud was, and then how he lived his life and why he got caught in this situation. It was something that is not something I had thought about. I think very many people who know about Freud didn't necessarily think that, since he was born in 1856, a lot of people did not realize he lived until the outbreak of World War II. And so how he got caught in that drama at the end of his life is a story in and of itself. And that I found fascinating. But I think it gets back to this issue of how someone like this could misjudge the situation to be caught. Although you do have to put into account that he was quite old by the time he was caught in this situation. He was over 80, and he'd been fighting jaw cancer from his cigar smoking for 15 years. So all of which makes a person inclined to say, I don't want to have a huge change in my life. He never wanted to live anywhere outside of Vienna, even though he sometimes complained about Vienna. But he was always, this was his home. This was where he had built his career and his family. So I hope that story illustrates again the dangers of becoming too complacent about your own surroundings when the world around you is going through huge upheavals. But the other part of it, I hope it will also bring to life Freud himself as more of a real person, a three-dimensional figure, with both very appealing aspects of his personality, some less appealing, some shortcomings. But I came away with a great deal of warmth, a feeling of warmth about Freud, and someone who could, for instance, at the very end of this process when he was trying to get out of Vienna, and had finally gone through all the hoops and paid all the fines and all that, which there are so-called flight tax, which the Nazis were imposing, and a Nazi official comes into his apartment and says, before we give you the exit permit, you have to sign this statement. And the statement reads, "Oh, I've been treated very well by the new authorities here of the Third Reich." And it goes on and on about how good his treatment was, when of course that was hardly the case. And he knows he's got to sign. He does it, but then as he finishes signing it, he turns to this guy and says, "Could I add one line?" And the line would read, "I would recommend the Gestapo to anyone." His housekeeper overheard this and practically dropped dead on the spot, she recalls. But the Nazi official simply grabbed the statement with his signature and rushed out the door. So Freud, yeah, he had incredible intellectual courage, integrity. His judgment was not always perfect by any means. I hope people come away with a greater appreciation of Freud. And I just, as I mentioned, felt a much more of an affection for Freud and the people around him. It's also a story of friendship, the love within that family, and the friendships he developed over his career. If he had not developed these very close ties with these people who I call his rescue squad, the Marie Bonapartes, the William Bullets, the Ernest Jones, and of course his own daughter Anna, and then his physician Max Schur in Austria, who was the other Austrian Jew in the mix. The others, by the way, were mostly not Jewish. They would not have been so devoted to him, and they would never have been able to pull off this extraordinary escape. So I hope it's just a good read, but also one that says something about the importance of friendship, of loyalty, and of not being perfect in your perception of the world, but being very honest about your feelings and your perceptions.
In your writing, it's very clear that Freud is not only this great literary figure, but also almost as important, or for him more important, it seems, he's a father figure to his family and also to some close friends. When you were learning about him and figuring out how to write this story, did you feel that you were able to relate to him more so, or did you ever relate Freud to your own father, who just coincidentally has a different version of the name Sigmund? I believe the Polish version.
Yeah, the Polish version, and my middle name is the Polish version, Zygmunt. So I'm Andrew Zygmunt Nagorski. So I guess that's not
It was destiny.
It was destiny, I guess. I never, when I grew up with that middle name, this to me seemed like an odd middle name to a kid growing up in the States from a Polish family. I never quite made it. It took me a while to make the connection. Oh, that's the same name. The German version is Sigmund Freud. I don't think that's why I wrote the book, but it's a nice cosmic connection, and I think also because my parents had to flee Poland. My father was in the Polish army in '39, and then managed to escape and found himself in exile, and then found himself in exile in Britain with Polish forces under British command. The odyssey of Freud and exile and so forth felt close to me too. There's some kinship there, I think, in terms of family stories, different circumstances, but in both cases, fleeing the Nazis, having to start their lives completely all over again. And the fact that I grew up as a American who happened to be born, by the way, in the UK, in Scotland, where my parents stayed after the war for a while, and my father had been in a Polish paratrooper unit based in Scotland, and then came to the States. And the fact that I grew up an American instead of a Pole is a product of that odyssey of exile. And so therefore stories of exile and how people's lives changed dramatically in this period. Of course, there are countless stories so that ended tragically. And it's also worth noting the other part of this story, which often is overlooked, is that Freud, 4 sisters who were still in Vienna when he left Vienna and who did not escape with him. There's some ambiguity about exactly why. I think they were also elderly. I think they did not want to go yet, and Freud left them money, and people still did not realize the dimensions of the horror that was about to descend. All 4 of those sisters died in the Holocaust. So people sometimes say, wouldn't have Freud survived if he had stayed in Vienna? First of all, health-wise, he wouldn't have survived that long, but if he had health-wise survived, I'm not sure he would have survived. I don't think he would have survived the Nazis.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add before the end? Talk about things that you're currently working on. I know that you're still writing articles that are very current and also I feel especially well suited for the time because of your experience in the Soviet Union in the 80s.
Yeah, unfortunately, that topic keeps coming back in relationship to what's happening now. But no, I don't have, if you're asking, do I have a new book project? Not yet. It takes me a while to figure out what that might be. And
but you're searching.
I'm beginning to search, let's say, just the way I came upon Freud by the way, reading Stefan Zweig's memoirs. Stefan Zweig, who was the famous Austrian Jewish writer at a contemporary of Freud's, and in his memoirs he talked about meeting Freud in Vienna, and then there's this long gap after Zweig leaves Austria in 1934, realizing after Hitler is taking power in neighboring Germany, this is not good for Jews anywhere. And then Freud shows up in London, and Zweig meets him again in London. And then that got me going on this whole notion of, well, why was Freud there so long when people like Zweig were getting out? And also Zweig began to allude to some of his circle of friends and just his personality, and it got me intrigued by all of the aspects of the story, which then developed into this book.
Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, keep an eye out for new content across our various social media platforms. The Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies promotes an understanding of the historic relationship between the United States and Austria, including lands of the former Habsburg Empire, by awarding grants and fellowships, organizing lectures and conferences, and publishing the Journal of Austrian-American History. We engage with a broader public audience through digital programming, including videos, podcasts, and blog posts. Auf Wiedersehen, and see you next time.